The stack of overdue bills occupied the center of the kitchen table like a tombstone. Sarah stared at the top envelope. The paper edges curled from humidity and neglect. Her apartment offered nothing back but the rhythmic, hollow pulse of the wall clock. Every tick felt like a countdown. She pushed the pile aside, the paper sliding across the laminate with a dry, abrasive rasp that seemed too loud in the empty room. Her bank balance was a single digit, a fact she had verified 3 times in the last hour. She checked the screen again. The number had not changed. She stood up, paced to the window, and looked down at the street where the city moved on without her. Her job was gone, her savings were gone, and the quiet of the room was becoming physical, a weight pressing against her chest. She turned back to the table, the bills still sitting there, waiting for a response she could not provide. She pulled her chair out, the legs scraping against the floorboards, and sat back down. There was no more room for panic. There was only the silence, the clock, and the final narrow space between her and total ruin. She pushed the bills to the edge of the table, creating a small, clear patch of laminate. Her old laptop sat nearby, its screen flickering to life with a sharp white glow that cut through the dim room. She did not open a resume. Instead, she opened a blank document to sketch a rough, geometric design. She stood, retrieved a scrap of cedar from the cabinet, and sat back down with a carving knife. The first slice of wood curled away, thin and pale, landing on the table. She worked with rhythmic, focused movements. Each pass of the blade produced a soft, woody friction, a sound that finally drowned out the ticking clock. Shavings piled up around her hands, a chaotic, fragrant drift of debris. She stopped only when the piece was smooth, the design finished. She picked up her phone, framed the ornament in the center of the frame, and took the photo. She navigated to a new marketplace site, filled in the fields, and uploaded the image. Her finger hovered over the screen for a heartbeat. Then she tapped the button. The screen refreshed, confirming the listing was live. She sat back, the knife still in her hand, watching the cursor blink in the empty digital storefront. The first week passed in a blur of blue light glare and static. Sarah opened the shop page every hour. Each time, the screen returned the same result. 0 views, 0 clicks, 0 interest. The digital storefront was a ghost town. She sat at the table until her eyes burned, waiting for a ping that never came. The silence of the apartment returned, heavier than before, mocking her effort. She did not close the laptop. Instead, she began to take the shop apart. She pulled the photos off the server, wiped the lens of her phone with a clean cloth, and spent the entire afternoon adjusting the lighting in the kitchen. She moved the table closer to the window, chasing the natural light. She rewritten every description, deleting the dry technical specs and replacing them with the story of the wood itself. She shaved $1 off the price, then another, grinding her teeth as she updated the listings. She hovered over the save button, checking the grammar, the keywords, and the clarity of every pixel. She refused to let the lack of traffic dictate her outcome. She refreshed the page one last time before dawn, watched the empty view counter, and started on a new design, her fingers moving with steady, relentless speed. 3 weeks of silence had conditioned her to expect nothing. She was hunched over the table, sanding a new batch of ornaments, the dust settling on her sleeves. The laptop screen was a dim, peripheral glow. Then, a sharp, unfamiliar chime cut through the air. It was not the hum of the refrigerator or the ticking of the clock. It was a clear, high-pitched ping. Sarah froze. The sandpaper slipped from her grip and clattered to the floor. She stared at the screen, her breath hitching in her throat. A banner blinked in the center of the browser. Order received. The words seemed to vibrate against the glass. She blinked, once, twice, expecting the page to refresh into emptiness. It did not. The address was real. The order was confirmed. A jolt of energy surged through her, shaking the numbness from her limbs. She stood so abruptly her chair skidded backward, hitting the wall. She scrambled to the drawer, fingers fumbling as she pulled out a roll of brown paper and a spool of twine. Her movements were jagged and fast. She grabbed the finished ornament, centered it on the paper, and folded the edges with trembling, precise force. She tied the twine, knotting it twice, her heart hammering against her ribs with the weight of the realization. She had made something, and someone else wanted it. The door swung open, and the cold air hit her skin like a physical blow. Outside, The world was gray. Rain lashed against the pavement, turning the street into a series of slick, dark mirrors. Sarah clutched the small brown package to her chest, shielding it with her body as if it were a fragile living thing. Each step toward the post office felt heavy, the water soaking through her shoes. But she did not break her pace. Her heart drummed against her ribs, a rhythmic, frantic beat that kept time with the rain. She checked the seal of the paper every few yards, terrified that the dampness might ruin the craftsmanship inside. The city hummed around her, indifferent to the small box she carried. But to her, the weight of it was absolute. It was not just an ornament, it was proof. It was the physical manifestation of 3 weeks of failure, struggle, and refusal to walk away. She pushed through the heavy glass doors of the post office, dripping wet and shivering, and stepped up to the counter. She placed the package down, her fingers lingering for a second longer than necessary. She watched the clerk weigh it, her pulse steadying into a calm, focused resolve. This was the first brick. She knew now she would lay 1,000 more. The apartment transformed into a workshop. The dining surface disappeared under a layer of industrial glue, raw timber, and stacks of shipping labels. Sarah kept the lamp burning until 2 a.m. every night. The silence of the room punctuated only by the scrape of wood against sandpaper and the rhythmic tearing of tape. Her hands grew calloused, the skin cracked from constant contact with adhesive. She stopped sleeping in segments. She slept in intervals between drying cycles. When a customer left a 5-star review, she pinned the printed notification to the wall, a white square of validation against the peeling paint. But the rhythm was brutal. One batch of wood warped in the humidity, and she spent the next 4 hours stripping the finish and starting over, her eyes burning from fatigue. She didn't pause for coffee. She didn't pause for rest. She replaced the failed pieces with new ones, her movements becoming mechanical, precise, and devoid of hesitation. Every failure was a design flaw to be corrected by dawn. She was no longer just making ornaments. She was building a machine out of her own endurance, forcing the small business to survive on pure, unrelenting momentum. The rhythm broke at 11 p.m. Sarah was sanding a batch of oak when her laptop, pushed to the edge of the table, chimed. Then it chimed again, a third, fourth, and fifth time in rapid succession. She set down the sandpaper, her hands shaking slightly from the day's labor, and leaned over the screen. A major influencer had posted a video featuring her work. The notification count was not climbing. It was accelerating. The screen flickered, struggling to refresh as hundreds of new orders flooded the database at once. Her heart skipped a beat, then hammered against her chest. She clicked refresh, and the number of unread alerts jumped by 50 in a single second. The silence of the apartment was shattered by the persistent, frantic pings. She stood frozen, watching the dashboard turn into a waterfall of red notification badges. The small, quiet business she had carefully nurtured was suddenly buried under a mountain of digital demand. She looked at the pile of half-finished ornaments, then back at the screen. The reality of the situation hit her like a physical weight. She was no longer a hobbyist working at a kitchen table. She was now the sole provider for 1,000 urgent requests. The machine she had spent months building was no longer just running. It was redlining. Sarah did not sleep. She did not sit. She moved. The first 12 hours were a blur of cardboard and packing tape. She cleared the kitchen floor to make room for shipments. Then the living room. Then the hallway. By the second day, the apartment was a maze of brown boxes, stacked to the ceiling in jagged, unstable towers. She crawled through the narrow gaps between stacks, her fingers raw and numb from the relentless friction of tape dispensers. Her skin was coated in a thin layer of paper dust. When she ran out of bubble wrap, she tore up old newspapers, her movements frantic and precise. She tripped over a stray roll of twine, landed hard on the hardwood, and stayed there for a beat, eyes closed, listening to the hum of the cooling fan on her laptop. She did not get up to rest. She got up to find the next box. Every surface was claimed. Every corner was an obstacle. By the 48th hour, the apartment was no longer a living space. It was a processing center. She taped the final label with trembling hands, her grip failing, the roll slipping from her bloodless fingers. She slumped against a stack of boxes, the silence finally returning to the room, heavier than before. The exhaustion of the packing marathon eventually gave way to a new kind of urgency. Sarah did not wait for the dust to settle. She took the earnings from those frantic days and redirected every cent into infrastructure. The boxes left the apartment, the clutter cleared, and in their place came the logistics of a growing business. She spent weeks touring industrial spaces until she found the one. The lease agreement sat on a clean, white surface, far removed from the kitchen table where this had begun. She signed the document, the ink grounding her transition from a home-based operator to a business owner. She walked into the new space, the echo of her footsteps replacing the sound of tape dispensers. Back at her desk, she logged into the dashboard. She watched the numbers crawl upward, a steady, relentless climb that had persisted long after the initial viral wave. Then, the screen flickered, the interface updated, and the million-dollar milestone flashed in bold, clear text. It was not a sudden explosion of noise or celebration. It was a quiet, singular confirmation of years of physical labor. She watched the cursor blink next to the total, the weight of the accomplishment settling into the stillness of the room. She had reached the target. The new studio was quiet, but it lacked the history that defined her. Sarah left the keys on the desk and drove back across the city. She climbed the stairs to the old apartment, the lock catching on the frame just as it always had. Inside, the space was empty. The boxes were gone. The clutter had vanished. Only the kitchen table remained. A scarred, uneven piece of wood sitting in the center of the room. She walked to it, the floorboards creaking under her weight. A sound that pulled her back to the first night she spent here, carving wood by the light of a flickering screen. She reached out, pressing her palm flat against the grain. The wood was cold, worn smooth by years of friction, glue, and desperate labor. There were no consultants, no champagne, and no noise. Just the steady, rhythmic ticking of the clock on the wall. She closed her eyes, feeling the texture of the surface beneath her fingers. She realized then that the millions of dollars were merely a byproduct. The victory was not in the destination, but in the decision she made on this very spot years ago, to keep moving, regardless of the odds. She stood in the silence, finally still, and let the truth of her own persistence anchor her to the floor.